I didn't lose the project because I failed. I lost it because my boss needed to remind me who had power. That's the part people don't understand. They assume there was a mistake, a missed deadline, a blown presentation, something clean and easy to explain. But nothing like that happened. The work was solid. The client was happy. The numbers were tracking better than forecast. If anything, this project had my fingerprints all over it in the best possible way. And that was the problem. Before I go any further, family, please hit that subscribe button, like, and tell us where you are watching from. Let's continue. I had been at the company for 4 years when the project landed on my desk. Not assigned to me officially. It just drifted there, the way real responsibility often does. One meeting led to another. One follow-up email turned into 10. Before I knew it, I was the one answering the client's late-night questions, rewriting proposals, smoothing over misunderstandings, and quietly keeping the whole thing moving. The client was a national retail brand. Big budget, high visibility, the kind of account that decides who gets promoted and who stays invisible. Internally, everyone knew it was important, but nobody wanted to fully own it yet. Too many unknowns. Too many moving parts. I didn't mind that. I've always been better when things are messy. My boss, Nathan, noticed the traction before he noticed the work. That was his pattern. He didn't read drafts. He didn't sit in brainstorming sessions. He noticed applause. He noticed when executives started saying my name without being prompted. The first time he pulled me aside about the project, he smiled too much. "Great job, keeping things afloat," he said, leaning against my desk like he was doing me a favor. "Just remember to loop me in before you send anything major." I nodded. I already had. He just hadn't opened the emails. Over the next few weeks, the client began asking for me, directly, not aggressively, casually. "Can you have her walk us through this? Can she join the next call? She understands our concerns better." Nathan started joining the calls more often after that. He'd sit quietly, camera on, nodding like a proud mentor. Then after, he'd send recap emails using a lot of "we" and "our strategy." I didn't correct him. Not yet. The project timeline tightened. Pressure increased. The client wanted faster turnaround. I delivered. Nights, weekends, early mornings. I wasn't trying to prove anything. I just wanted the work to be right. Then, one Monday morning, I walked into a meeting I wasn't supposed to be in. I know that sounds strange, but hear me out. I was grabbing coffee near the main conference room when I heard my name. Not whispered. Said clearly, with the door half open. I wasn't eavesdropping. I just stopped moving. Nathan was inside with 2 senior directors. "She's been helpful," he was saying, "but I think it's time we reassign leadership. The client's getting too attached." One of the directors laughed. "That's usually a good thing." "Not when it blurs authority," Nathan replied. "They need a single point of leadership. Someone with experience." I waited for someone to mention that I had been leading it. No one did. I didn't walk in. I didn't confront him. I finished my coffee and went back to my desk, telling myself there was probably context I didn't have. By lunchtime, the calendar invite hit. Project leadership update. Mandatory. That's how it happened. No warning. No conversation beforehand. Just a neat, sanitized announcement where Nathan explained that for strategic alignment, he would be stepping in as the project lead, and I would be supporting at a higher level. Supporting. Higher level. Words that sound good until you realize they mean you've been sidelined. I watched the clients' faces on the video call. Confusion first, then restraint, then silence. Nobody argued in the meeting. That came later. After the call, Nathan asked me to stay back. "This isn't a reflection of your performance," he said quickly, like he was reading from a script. "You've done excellent work, but visibility at this level requires balance." "Balance between what?" I asked. He smiled again. "Between enthusiasm and authority." I went back to my desk and stared at my screen for a long time. Not because I was emotional, because I was calculating. Something about the move didn't make sense. Not politically, not strategically, not financially. The emails started coming in almost immediately. Internal ones first. Coworkers asking what happened, telling me they were confused. One person wrote, "I thought you were running that." I replied professionally, briefly. I didn't explain. I didn't vent. Then the external email arrived. It was from the client's project director. Subject line neutral. Tone polite. But the message underneath was anything but. She wrote that they were surprised by the leadership change and asked if I would still be involved in decision-making conversations. I forwarded it to Nathan. His reply came 10 minutes later. "Please let me handle client communication going forward." That was the moment I realized this wasn't about the project. It was about control. Over the next 2 weeks, the cracks showed. Nathan missed details I had been tracking for months. He promised timelines that didn't account for dependencies. He dismissed feedback I knew mattered. The client started copying me again. Quietly at first, then more directly. Nathan noticed. He stopped acknowledging my messages in meetings. He'd interrupt when I tried to clarify. He reframed my points as if they were his own, sometimes getting them wrong. I let him, not because I was afraid, because I wanted a record. Every email, every revision, every decision request that went unanswered. I kept it all. Organized, time-stamped, clean. The client escalated concerns by week 3. They asked for a check-in with leadership. Nathan scheduled it without telling me. I found out because the calendar invite accidentally included my name before being removed. I wasn't supposed to be there. The day of the call, I joined anyway. Not aggressively, not visibly. I joined with my camera off and my mic muted like a fly on the wall. No one kicked me out. The client didn't waste time. "We need to address the drop in clarity," she said. Things were smoother before the transition. Nathan gave a polished answer. Blamed shifting scope. Blamed internal approvals. Blamed growing pains. Then she said something that changed everything. Would it be possible to bring her back into the lead role? Even temporarily. The difference has been noticeable. Silence. Nathan tried to laugh it off. She's still supporting the project. The client didn't smile. That's not what we're asking. The call ended politely, but the message was clear. Afterward, Nathan stormed into my workspace. "What was that?" he demanded. I kept my voice even. "You told me to support." I did. He stared at me like he was seeing me for the first time. Not as an employee, as a problem. That's when the retaliation started. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Subtle. Deadlines shifted without notice. Access revoked. My role minimized in documentation. Little things meant to frustrate, not explode. He thought I'd back off. Instead, the client pushed harder. They requested a formal review of the project's management. They asked for data, metrics, historical comparisons, everything they needed. I already had. And this time, I didn't forward it to Nathan first. I sent it directly to the client liaison who had asked for transparency. That email is where the story truly turns. Because once the client saw the timeline laid out clearly, with my name attached to the successful phase and Nathan's attached to the decline, there was no unseeing it. And they weren't subtle about what they wanted next. They demanded my return, not as support, as lead. Nathan didn't know yet, but he was about to. And he had no idea how much ground he had already lost. Nathan didn't hear about the client's demand for me. He heard it from his boss. That mattered. Because when power shifts in a workplace, it's rarely the message itself that does damage. It's who delivers it, and how far up the chain it travels before landing. I found out the escalation had happened because my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Slack messages first, then texts. People asking if I was okay. People asking if I knew what was going on. One person I barely spoke to wrote, I think something big is happening with the retail account. I didn't respond to any of them. I was too busy watching Nathan. From my desk, I had a clear line of sight to his office. Glass walls. Another design choice meant to look transparent while hiding everything that mattered. I saw his phone light up. I saw his posture change. Shoulders stiff. Jaw tighten. He stood up so fast his chair rolled back into the wall. He didn't come to me right away. That was deliberate. He needed time to think, to plan, to figure out how to regain control of a narrative that had slipped. Instead, he called an emergency meeting with leadership. Closed door, blinds half drawn, the kind of meeting that didn't exist officially but rearranged careers, quietly. I wasn't invited. I wasn't supposed to be. But this time, I didn't need to listen through doors or read between lines. I already knew the facts. The client had compared performance phases. They had attached names. They had asked a direct question leadership couldn't ignore. Why was the person who stabilized the project removed? That's not a question you can answer with buzzwords. When Nathan finally emerged from the meeting, his face looked calm in the way people get when they're trying not to panic. He walked straight to my desk. "We need to talk," he said. "Not can we. Not when you have a moment. We need to talk." I followed him into his office. The door closed. The glass walls suddenly felt less symbolic and more like an aquarium. Everyone could see us. No one could hear. He didn't sit. Neither did I. "I want to be clear," he started. "You went around me." "I responded to a client request for information," I said. "That information should have come through me. The client asked for transparency." "And I'm the project lead," he snapped. I waited. Let the silence stretch. People like Nathan hate silence when they don't control it. "You put me in a difficult position," he continued, lowering his voice. "Leadership is asking questions now." "They should," I said. That's when his tone shifted. Less anger. More threat. "Do you understand how this looks?" he asked. "From their perspective, it looks like you're undermining authority." I wasn't aware authority meant hiding data. He exhaled sharply. "This is exactly why the client got too attached. You don't understand hierarchy." "No," I replied. "I understand results." That's when he finally sat down. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "We're going to smooth this over. You'll take a step back publicly. I'll reassure leadership that there's alignment, and we'll keep things moving." "And the client?" I asked. He paused. Just a fraction of a second. "Enough. We'll manage them." I nodded slowly. "They're not asking to be managed. They're asking for me." "That's temporary," he said quickly. "Clients get emotional. They latch onto familiarity." "Or competence," I said. His eyes hardened. "You're crossing a line," he warned. "No," I said. "I'm standing on one you moved." The meeting ended without resolution. That was new. Nathan hated unresolved conversations. He liked clean endings where he walked away feeling superior. This one didn't give him that. Within hours, subtle changes began. My access to certain folders disappeared. Tools I'd used daily suddenly required permission. Calendar invites stopped including me entirely. It was quiet retaliation, the kind meant to isolate without leaving fingerprints. I documented everything, not emotionally, practically. At the same time, the client escalated again, this time formally. A written request addressed to senior leadership, not Nathan. They cited delays, confusion, deviation from agreed processes, and then, plainly, they stated that their preference was for me to resume leadership of the project. Preference. Such a polite word for a demand. Leadership scheduled a review meeting. This one was official. Agenda sent. Notes expected. Nathan tried to get ahead of it. The night before the meeting, he emailed me. "I need you to align with the messaging tomorrow," he wrote. "This isn't the time for internal disagreements." I stared at the screen for a long time before replying. "I'll speak truthfully," I wrote back. "As I always have." He didn't respond. The meeting took place in the largest conference room we had. Senior directors, a VP, legal dialed in. The client joined remotely. I was invited this time. Nathan opened with a prepared statement. He talked about strategic adjustments, about shared accountability, about learning curves. Then the client spoke. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't accuse. They simply walked through the timeline. Calmly, methodically, they showed when communication slowed, when deliverables slipped, when questions went unanswered. All dates aligned with the leadership change. Then they showed emails. Mine. His. The difference was obvious. They ended with a single sentence. We would like her reinstated as project lead effective immediately, or we will need to reconsider our partnership. That sentence changed the room. Nathan tried to speak. Leadership raised a hand. They asked me questions instead. Direct ones. What processes had I implemented earlier? How had I handled risk? What was my plan to get the project back on track? I answered simply, clearly, without emotion. I didn't attack Nathan. I didn't need to. Facts did the work for me. After the client signed off, leadership stayed behind. Nathan looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Not physically. Structurally. The support beneath him had shifted. The VP turned to him. Why wasn't this information shared earlier? She asked. Nathan stammered. We were aligning internally. Withholding performance data from leadership is not alignment, she replied. Then she turned to me. We're reinstating you as project lead, she said. Effective today. She paused, and we'll be reviewing management decisions related to this project. Nathan didn't look at me. He left the room first. I stayed behind, answering a few more questions, clarifying next steps. When I finally returned to my desk, the office felt different. Quieter, watchful. People smiled at me cautiously, like they weren't sure which version of me would walk past. Nathan didn't speak to me for the rest of the day, but the next morning he sent a company-wide email announcing the updated project structure. He framed it as a collaborative decision, praised my supportive role, avoided the word reinstated. I didn't correct him publicly. I didn't need to, because the real consequences hadn't arrived yet. They were coming, and Nathan knew it. I could tell by the way he avoided eye contact, by the way he suddenly asked for one-on-ones with HR, by the way leadership started looping me into conversations he used to control alone. The client was satisfied for now, but the internal fallout was only beginning. And Nathan was about to learn that removing someone quietly doesn't mean you can erase what they built, especially when the people watching finally see the truth. Getting the title back didn't feel like victory. It felt like responsibility snapping back into place. By the time the official email went out confirming I was the project lead again, the office had already rearranged itself around the news. Conversations stopped when I walked by. People watched more closely. Some smiled like they were relieved. Others looked uncomfortable, like they'd been quietly betting on the wrong outcome. Nathan didn't acknowledge the change directly. He didn't congratulate me. He didn't push back either. He did something more dangerous. He complied. On paper, everything was correct. My access was restored. I was re-added to meetings. My name returned to documentation where it had quietly disappeared. From the outside, it looked like a smooth reset. But underneath, there was tension. Nathan had lost the client-facing authority he cared about most. And people like him don't forget that kind of loss. They don't process it. They store it. The first week back in control, I focused only on the work. I rebuilt timelines, re-established communication rhythms, cleared up confusion that never should have existed. The client responded immediately. Faster approvals, clearer direction, trust restored. Leadership noticed. They didn't say it outright, but the difference was visible in how meetings flowed again. Less friction, fewer follow-ups, fewer excuses. Nathan stayed quiet during those meetings, took notes, asked procedural questions. The kind meant to look engaged without offering anything of substance. I didn't call him out. I didn't need to, but he started doing something else. He started documenting me. Every small disagreement, every decision he didn't agree with. Every time I bypassed him to speak directly with leadership or the client, which was now part of my role. He framed it as diligence. I recognized it as insurance. It didn't take long before HR reached out. Not formally, casually. They asked if I'd be open to a check-in to talk about team dynamics on the project. I agreed immediately. When you've done nothing wrong, transparency is a weapon. The HR representative asked neutral questions. How was the transition back? Any concerns? Anything leadership should be aware of? I answered honestly. I talked about the project, about progress, about what needed support. I didn't complain about Nathan. I didn't accuse. I just explained how decisions were being made and where authority currently sat. She nodded, took notes, thanked me. 2 days later, Nathan called me into his office again. This time he smiled. I hear HR's been talking to you, he said lightly. They asked for a check-in, I replied. Of course they did, he said. It's standard. He paused. I just want to make sure we're aligned. You don't see this as some kind of competition, do you? I see it as a job, I said. He laughed softly. Good, because that's how leadership wants it framed. Framed. That word stuck with me. Not managed. Not resolved. Framed. Nathan was trying to control perception now that he couldn't control outcomes. Over the next month, he made several quiet attempts to reassert relevance. He scheduled overlapping meetings without consulting me. He gave feedback directly to junior team members that contradicted mine, then claimed miscommunication. He inserted himself into email threads late, adding comments that sounded authoritative but didn't change anything. Each time, I corrected course calmly, publicly when necessary, privately when possible, and every time the client responded to me, not him. That was the part he couldn't fix. The breaking point came during a quarterly review. This was a big one. Executive presence. Slides polished. Numbers scrutinized. I presented the results. Clear improvements. On-time delivery restored. Cost overrun stabilized. The room was satisfied. Then Nathan spoke. He reframed the recovery as a team effort driven by leadership alignment. He highlighted process changes he had supported. He implied that earlier challenges were part of an expected learning curve. It was subtle, but leadership noticed the discrepancy between his words and the documented timeline. One executive asked a simple question. When exactly did these changes occur? Nathan hesitated. I answered, immediately following the leadership adjustment requested by the client. Silence. No one challenged me. No one defended him. After the meeting, leadership asked me to stay behind again. This was becoming a pattern. They asked about my career goals. That question always comes before something changes. I answered honestly. I said I wanted growth, more responsibility, opportunities where impact mattered. They nodded. Then they asked about Nathan. Specifically, they asked whether his involvement had been constructive. I didn't sugarcoat it. I didn't attack him either. I said the truth, that some decisions had slowed progress, that clarity improved when authority was direct, that mixed leadership created confusion. They thanked me. That was it. The following week, Nathan was reassigned. Not fired, not demoted publicly, reassigned to internal initiatives. Everyone knew what that meant. No client-facing work, no visibility, no influence. He cleaned out his office quietly. On his last day on the project, he stopped by my desk. I didn't expect this, he said. I know, I replied. He looked like he wanted to say more, to justify, to explain, to accuse. Instead, he nodded and walked away. I watched him go, not with satisfaction, but with clarity. This wasn't revenge. It was consequence. The project went on to become one of the company's strongest accounts that year. I was promoted 6 months later. And every time someone new joined the team and asked about the early chaos, the story was always softened. Leadership changes, growing pains, lessons learned. But I remember exactly how it happened. Not with shouting, not with drama, but with someone trying to take credit for work they didn't do, and a client who refused to let it slide. The real lesson wasn't about standing up to a boss. It was about understanding that when you build something well enough, the truth eventually surfaces, no matter who tries to bury it. People assume the whole thing ends when the boss is reassigned. Like that's the payoff. Like everything snaps back into balance, and the office exhales and moves on. That's not how it works. Because removing someone from power doesn't erase the systems they benefited from, and it doesn't undo the habits they normalized. Nathan leaving the project created a vacuum, and vacuums don't stay empty for long. In the weeks after his reassignment, I started noticing things I hadn't had time to see before. Small inconsistencies, old approval chains that no longer made sense, processes designed less for efficiency and more for control, decisions that had been slowed down not by necessity but by ego. Nathan hadn't just managed poorly. He'd built an environment where visibility mattered more than contribution. And now that environment was my responsibility. Leadership didn't say it outright, but the expectation was clear. Fix the project. Fix the team. Fix the damage without creating noise. I started with the basics. Clear ownership, transparent timelines, written decisions, no side conversations that change direction quietly. No meetings without agendas. No, just trust me logic. Some people adjusted immediately. They were relieved. Others resisted in subtle ways. They'd CC unnecessary people, ask for approvals that weren't needed, delay decisions by requesting more alignment. Those people had thrived under Nathan, and they were nervous. One of them was Darren. Darren had been Nathan's right-hand man for years. Not officially, but functionally. He knew how to frame conversations upward. He knew how to redirect credit sideways. He'd stayed very quiet during the client escalation, which told me everything I needed to know. A few weeks after Nathan's reassignment, Darren asked for a meeting. Just the two of us. I want to make sure we're aligned, he said, using Nathan's favorite word. I let him talk. He complimented my leadership, praised the project's turnaround, mentioned how different things felt now. Then he casually suggested that maybe we could bring back some of the old flexibility in decision-making. What do you mean by flexibility? I asked. Well, he said carefully, less rigid structure. More trust. Trust in whom? I asked. He smiled thinly. The team. I nodded. The team has clarity now. That's why things are working. His smile faded. That level of structure can feel restrictive, he said. To people who relied on ambiguity, I replied. The meeting ended politely. 2 days later, I found out Darren had gone to leadership. He'd framed concerns about my management style. Too rigid, too process-driven, too focused on documentation. Leadership asked me about it directly. I didn't defend myself emotionally. I showed them the outcomes, the metrics, the client feedback, the reduction in rework. That was the difference now. Before, Nathan controlled the story. Now the story was backed by data. Leadership supported me. Darren backed off. But the ripple effects continued. HR launched a broader review of project management practices across the department, not officially tied to Nathan, not framed as corrective, framed as optimization. People who had been comfortable before started sweating. Old decisions were re-examined, resource allocations questioned, performance reviews recalibrated, and slowly, quietly the culture shifted, not dramatically, not overnight, but enough that people started choosing substance over optics. I'd like to say I felt proud. Mostly I felt tired. Fixing something broken by ego takes more energy than building something new. The client remained engaged. More than engaged, they became vocal advocates. They praised the turnaround publicly, mentioned my name in leadership calls, requested my involvement in adjacent initiatives. That visibility mattered. It also painted a target. A few months after the promotion conversation, I was officially offered a new role. Expanded scope, higher visibility, more authority. I accepted. Nathan heard about it through the same channels he once controlled. We crossed paths once after that. In the elevator, just the two of us. He looked different, less polished, more careful. "Congratulations," he said. "Thank you," I replied. There was a pause. "I never meant to hold you back," he said finally. I looked at him. "You didn't," I said. "You just showed me who I couldn't rely on." The elevator doors opened. That was it. No apology, no closure, just acknowledgement. And that was enough. Because the truth is, workplace revenge doesn't look like shouting matches or dramatic exits. It looks like accountability. It looks like systems correcting themselves once the right pressure is applied. It looks like someone trying to control the narrative and losing to the facts. I didn't win because I fought harder. I won because I stayed visible, stayed documented, and let the truth do what it always does eventually. Surface. And every time I hear someone say, "Just keep your head down," I think about how close I came to disappearing quietly. If the client hadn't spoken up, if leadership hadn't asked the right questions, if I had chosen silence over record keeping, this story would have ended very differently. And Nathan would still be smiling in meetings, taking credit for work he didn't do. That's why I tell it, not for revenge, but as a reminder. Sometimes the most powerful move you can make is refusing to let someone rewrite what you built, and trusting that, sooner or later, someone important will notice. By the time my new role officially kicked in, most people assumed the tension had settled. From the outside, it looked clean. The project was stable. The client was happy. Leadership had moved on to the next crisis. Nathan was no longer in the picture in any meaningful way. But organizations have long memories. And so do the people who benefited from the old order. My expanded role meant I now oversaw multiple projects, not just the one that had caused the fallout. Different teams, different managers, different politics. What surprised me wasn't how different they were, but how familiar the patterns felt. The same behaviors showed up again and again. People who spoke confidently but delivered vaguely. People who stayed close to leadership without ever getting close to the work. People who framed mistakes as misunderstandings and successes as team wins, unless they could safely claim them alone. I wasn't naive enough to think Nathan had been an anomaly. He had been a symptom. The difference now was that I could see it early. One of my first challenges came from a project that wasn't even mine originally. It had been struggling quietly for months. Missed milestones, frustrated stakeholders, no clear owner. Leadership handed it to me with a careful tone, the kind that suggested they were hoping for a turnaround without admitting there had been a failure. I reviewed the documentation, or what passed for it. Emails contradicted each other. Decisions had no recorded rationale. Deadlines shifted without explanation. Every problem had been discussed, but nothing had been resolved. And at the center of it all was a manager named Elise. Elise was different from Nathan on the surface. Softer voice, more collaborative language. She didn't dominate rooms. She agreed with everyone. That was the problem. In meetings, she nodded, took notes, promised follow-ups, and then nothing happened. Or worse, something happened in a completely different direction, based on a conversation no one else had been part of. When I asked her for clarity, she smiled apologetically. "There's just been a lot of moving parts," she said. That phrase again, moving parts. I asked her to walk me through the last major decision. She hesitated, then gave a vague explanation that didn't align with the outcomes. I asked for the written approval. She said she'd look for it. She never did. The team under her was exhausted. Not dramatic about it, just quiet, disengaged. They did what they were told, then waited for the next change. I recognized the signs. This wasn't malicious incompetence. It was fear-driven leadership, the kind that avoids decisions to avoid blame. And it was hurting the work. I escalated carefully, not to remove her, not immediately. I requested a structured review, clear roles, decision logs, accountability checkpoints. Elise resisted, not openly, passively. She delayed responses, missed meetings, claimed misunderstandings, tried to reframe the changes as unnecessary bureaucracy. Leadership noticed. They asked me directly if I thought she could handle the project with support. I answered honestly. I think the project needs clarity more than comfort, I said. Right now it has neither. They reassigned the project. Elise wasn't demoted. She was moved to a role better aligned with her strengths. I started seeing a pattern. People weren't being punished. They were being exposed. And that exposure was uncomfortable for a lot of people. Some responded by improving. Others responded by resenting me. I didn't need everyone to like me, but I did need allies. That's when I realized something important. Nathan had lost because he was alone when it mattered. He had surrounded himself with people who benefited from ambiguity, not people who would defend substance. I wasn't going to make the same mistake. I invested in the people who did the work, the quiet ones, the ones who delivered without drama, the ones who documented without being asked. I pulled them into visible roles. Let them speak in meetings. Let leadership hear from them directly. That changed the power dynamics fast. It also created enemies. One afternoon, I was called into a meeting with a senior director I didn't report to directly. He closed the door and got straight to the point. "You're shaking things up," he said. "Yes," I replied. "Some people feel threatened." "I know." He studied me. "You don't seem concerned." "I'm concerned about outcomes," I said, "not comfort." He leaned back. "That approach can create resistance." "So can dysfunction," I replied. He smiled slightly. "You remind me of someone." I didn't ask who, because I already knew. The difference was that I wasn't trying to control the narrative. I was letting it form around results. Still, the pressure increased. Feedback became more pointed. Expectations higher. Scrutiny constant. Every decision I made was examined. That's when I understood something else. Revenge in the workplace doesn't end with one victory. It evolves into a test. Once you've challenged the status quo successfully, you don't get to relax. You get to prove that it wasn't a fluke, that you weren't just right once, that you're right consistently. I leaned into that. I tightened processes further, increased transparency, reduced reliance on back-channel conversations, forced decisions into the open. Some people left, not dramatically, quiet resignations, transfers, people who realized the environment no longer favored their style. Others stepped up. The culture shifted again, and with each shift, the company became stronger. Not perfect, but honest. Then something unexpected happened. Nathan resurfaced. Not internally, externally. I heard about it through a recruiter. She called me one afternoon, casual tone, friendly. "I wanted to ask if you'd be open to a conversation about a leadership role," she said. I listened. Then she added, "Your former manager spoke highly of you." I paused. "Nathan?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "He's consulting with a firm we're working with." I thanked her and ended the call. I sat there for a long time afterward. It would have been easy to feel angry, or amused, or validated. Instead, I felt something closer to clarity. Nathan wasn't a villain. He was a product of a system that rewarded visibility over value. When that system shifted, he lost his footing. Now he was adapting, finding relevance elsewhere. I didn't hate him for that, but I didn't forget, because the story wasn't really about him anymore. It was about what happens after you stop letting people take credit for your work. It was about what you build when you refuse to disappear quietly. And it was about the fact that once you choose transparency, there's no going back to comfortable lies. The project that started it all became a case study internally, not with names attached, just lessons. Leadership referenced it often. They talked about accountability, about client trust, about the risks of misaligned authority. No one said my name. They didn't need to. Everyone knew. And every time a new manager tried to play games with credit or control, someone would quietly say, "Let's make sure we don't repeat that situation." That was the real revenge. Not the promotion, not Nathan's reassignment, but the fact that the system learned. And once a system learns, it becomes very hard to manipulate again, at least not in the same way. And that's when I realized something else. The story still wasn't over, because growth brings bigger rooms, and bigger rooms bring bigger egos. And somewhere ahead of me, there would be another Nathan, only smarter, more careful, and harder to expose. But now I was ready. The next Nathan didn't announce himself. He didn't take credit loudly. He didn't block access obviously. He didn't underestimate me openly. He smiled. He praised. He agreed. And that made him far more dangerous. His name was Victor. Victor joined the company as part of a senior leadership hire. Impressive resume, industry recognition, the kind of background that made people straighten their posture when he entered a room. He wasn't in my direct line, but close enough that our work overlapped constantly. From the beginning, he positioned himself as an ally. "I've heard a lot about how you turn things around," he told me during our first one-on-one. "We need more leaders like you." I thanked him, didn't absorb it. Praise without context is usually a setup. Victor had a talent for inserting himself into high-impact conversations just before decisions were finalized. He didn't disrupt. He refined. He'd ask thoughtful questions that subtly reframed ownership. He'd summarize discussions in ways that centered him as the connector. People liked him. Leadership trusted him. And he was very careful never to overstep. At first, our paths crossed more frequently as my scope expanded. I noticed that when I presented outcomes, Victor followed with strategic framing. When I solved operational problems, he discussed vision. When credit was being assigned, he spoke broadly about direction. He never claimed my work. He absorbed it. That was the difference. The first time I felt the shift was during a cross-functional review. I laid out a recovery plan for a struggling initiative. Clear actions, owners assigned, risks documented. Victor followed my presentation. "What she's describing," he said, "aligns perfectly with the framework we've been developing at the leadership level." Framework. I hadn't seen that framework. Heads nodded. No one challenged it. After the meeting, someone congratulated Victor on his approach. I watched it happen. Didn't react. Not yet. The next few weeks confirmed the pattern. Victor began requesting to partner on initiatives that already had direction. He positioned himself as support while gradually becoming the face of execution to leadership. He didn't block me. He redirected perception. And, unlike Nathan, he documented everything. Not transparently. Strategically. He sent recap emails that subtly reordered contributions. He summarized meetings in ways that elevated his role as the decision-maker. He CC'd leadership on messages that framed alignment around his guidance. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it. But once you've lived through something once, you recognize the shape of it even when the details change. I adjusted my approach. I stopped assuming shared understanding. I clarified ownership publicly, not defensively, casually. When Victor reframed my work as part of his framework, I followed up with written documentation referencing the original decisions, timelines, and ownership. Not accusatory, precise. Victor noticed. He didn't push back directly. He smiled more, complimented my thoroughness, praised my attention to detail. He began inviting me to more meetings. That was another tactic. proximity without authority. He wanted to be seen as collaborative while continuing to steer narrative. Leadership started asking him questions about projects I owned. He answered confidently. That's when I changed strategy again. I requested a formal review cadence where project leads presented directly to leadership without intermediaries. I framed it as efficiency, as clarity, as a way to reduce bottlenecks. Leadership agreed. Victor supported the idea publicly. Privately, he didn't like it. During the first session under the new structure, I presented directly. No framing, no interpretation, just facts. Leadership asked me questions. Victor stayed quiet. Afterward, he pulled me aside. You handled that well, he said. But be careful. Some leaders prefer synthesis over detail. Then they can ask for synthesis, I replied. His smile tightened. You're very direct, he said. I've found it works, I replied. The tension between us was subtle but growing. Victor began positioning himself as a strategic overseer rather than an operator. He talked about long-term vision, about scaling, about influence. I focused on outcomes. Leadership noticed both. That's when the company announced a major restructuring. New divisions, new reporting lines, new opportunities, and new competition. 2 roles were being created. High visibility, executive facing. One of them aligned perfectly with my experience. Victor wanted it too. He didn't say that directly, but he started referencing the role in conversations, talking about readiness, about perspective, about leadership presence. I continued working. When the application process opened, I submitted my name. So did Victor. The review process was intense. Panel interviews, case studies, peer feedback. Victor performed well. I knew that. But performance in interviews isn't the same as performance under pressure. One of the case scenarios involved a simulated client escalation, a sudden loss of trust, conflicting internal priorities, limited time. It was familiar, too familiar. Victor approached it conceptually. He talked about alignment, about communication strategy, about executive messaging. I approached it operationally. I laid out steps, accountability, data transparency, direct engagement. The panel noticed the difference. During peer feedback, something unexpected happened. People spoke up. Team members I'd elevated, colleagues I'd supported, stakeholders who had seen the work firsthand. They talked about trust. They talked about clarity. They talked about knowing who to go to when things went wrong. Victor received strong feedback too, but it was different. People described him as influential, strategic, well-connected. No one said they relied on him when things broke. That mattered. When the decision was announced, leadership called me first. They offered me the role. Victor received the other one. Different scope, less operational control, more advisory. He congratulated me publicly. Privately, he was cold. The dynamic shifted again. Victor stopped trying to absorb my work. Instead, he tried to distance himself from outcomes altogether. When things went well, he praised the team. When things went poorly, he emphasized strategic constraints. I didn't engage, because by then something had changed. Leadership had learned to differentiate influence from impact. And once they see that difference, it's hard to unsee. Victor wasn't removed. He wasn't punished. He was contained. And that's often worse for people like him, because it limits their reach. The irony wasn't lost on me. Nathan had tried to control visibility and lost. Victor tried to control narrative and stalled. Different tactics. Same result. The system no longer rewarded those behaviors. Not because of me alone, but because enough people had experienced the cost of letting them run unchecked. I thought about that often. About how change doesn't come from confrontation. It comes from consistency, from refusing to participate in distortions, from building something so solid that it can't be reframed without breaking. And I knew something else now too. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about stewardship. about protecting work, protecting people, protecting truth in environments that quietly discourage it. The stakes were higher now, the rooms bigger, the egos sharper, but so was I. And somewhere down the line, I knew there would be another test. Not because I was unlucky, but because systems only stay honest when someone is willing to keep them that way. And this time, I wasn't waiting to be pushed out before stepping forward. I was already there. The higher I went, the quieter the resistance became. At lower levels, conflict is loud. People argue. They complain. They posture. But once you enter executive space, resistance changes form. It becomes procedural, polite, hidden inside process. That's where the real damage happens. My new role came with authority, but also constraints. Everything had a framework now. Committees, review boards, decision matrices. On paper, it was all designed to prevent the kind of power concentration that had caused problems before. In practice, it created new hiding places. I started noticing delays that didn't make sense. Proposals stalled not because of flaws, but because they were under review. Decisions bounced between groups that had overlapping authority. Accountability blurred just enough that no one could be blamed directly. And in the middle of it all was a familiar behavior pattern. Not one person, several. Mid-level leaders who had learned to survive by never fully committing, by agreeing in meetings and stalling in execution, by protecting their image instead of their outcomes. They weren't villains. They were cautious. And caution, unchecked, can be just as destructive as ego. One situation crystallized it for me. We were launching a new initiative tied to the same client who had once demanded my return. Expanded scope, bigger investment, more eyes on it. The planning phase went smoothly. Too smoothly. Everyone agreed. Everyone aligned. Everyone approved. Then execution began. Deadlines slipped. Dependencies weren't met. Decisions that had been final were suddenly revisited. I asked for clarity. People offered explanations. Resource constraints. Competing priorities. Miscommunication. None of it added up. So I did what I'd learned to do best. I mapped it. I laid out every decision, every approval, every handoff. Who owned what? Who delayed what? Where momentum died. The pattern was clear. 3 leaders were acting as bottlenecks, not intentionally sabotaging, just refusing to move without unanimous agreement. And unanimous agreement never came. I brought it to leadership, not as an accusation, as a risk. If we continue like this, I said, we'll miss the window. Not because we can't deliver, because no one is willing to decide. One executive pushed back. We don't want to create resentment, he said. Forcing decisions can hurt morale. Unclear ownership hurts morale more, I replied. Silence. Then another executive nodded. She'd been watching too. They gave me permission to intervene. That's when things got uncomfortable. I called a meeting with the 3 bottlenecks. Clear agenda. Clear expectations. I didn't threaten. I didn't accuse. I assigned ownership. Directly. You own this decision. You own this timeline. You own this outcome. 2 of them reacted with relief. 1 reacted with anger. He pushed back, questioned authority, framed my approach as aggressive. I stayed calm. I'm not asking you to agree with everything, I said. I'm asking you to decide. He escalated, tried to go around me, claimed I was overstepping. Leadership backed me. That was new. The decision was made. The project moved forward. And suddenly a lot of constraints disappeared. The initiative launched on time. The client praised execution. The same executive who'd warned about morale pulled me aside afterward. You were right, he admitted. We've been avoiding discomfort. That sentence stayed with me. Avoiding discomfort. That's what Nathan had done by pushing me out instead of addressing his insecurity. That's what Victor had done by reframing work instead of owning outcomes. And that's what these leaders had been doing by hiding behind consensus. Different forms, Same route. I started speaking about it openly, not naming names, naming behaviors, in leadership forums, in reviews, in strategy sessions. I talked about decision ownership, about the cost of delay, about how politeness can become paralysis. Some people listened, others bristled, but no one could argue with the results. That visibility brought opportunities. It also brought risk. I became associated with change, and change attracts scrutiny. HR asked me to mentor a group of emerging leaders, high potential employees being groomed for management. I agreed. During one session, a young woman asked a question that stopped me. What do you do when your boss takes credit for your work? The room went quiet. I didn't answer immediately. I told them a version of the truth. I talked about documentation, about allies, about patience, about knowing when to speak and when to let the system reveal itself. I didn't promise fairness. I promised clarity. After the session, several people reached out privately. Stories poured in, similar patterns, different departments, different managers. I realized something then. What had happened to me wasn't rare. It was just rarely confronted. Most people leave. They find another job, another company, another system. They don't fight back. And I understood why. It's exhausting, but it also means the same behaviors get rewarded again and again. I didn't judge anyone for leaving, but I made a choice to stay, at least for now, because staying gave me leverage. And leverage, when used responsibly, can reshape environments. The company began formalizing what I'd been doing informally. Clear ownership models, decision logs, transparent escalation paths. Not perfect, but better. Nathan and Victor became cautionary tales. Not publicly, but privately. People referenced them in whispers. That situation, that restructure, that lesson. Their names weren't important anymore. The behaviors were. One evening, long after most people had left, I sat alone in a conference room looking at the city lights outside the window. I thought about the version of myself who'd sat at her desk after being quietly removed from a project she built, who'd stared at her screen and decided to document instead of explode, who'd trusted a client to notice. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady, because I knew something now that I hadn't before. Power doesn't belong to titles. It belongs to clarity, to people who are willing to make decisions visible, to people who refuse to let work be erased quietly. And I also knew something else. The higher you go, the more tempting it becomes to stop pushing, to protect your position, to avoid conflict, to become what you once fought. That was the real test. Not beating Nathan, not outmaneuvering Victor, but staying honest once the system finally worked in your favor. And that test never ends. It just gets quieter and harder to explain. But I was still paying attention. And as long as I was, the story wasn't finished yet. The moment you become part of leadership, people start watching what you tolerate more than what you say. That took me longer to understand than I'd like to admit. I thought consistency in results would be enough, that clear frameworks and accountability would carry the culture forward on their own. But culture doesn't move on policy alone. It moves on what people see go unchallenged. And I missed something. It started small. A senior manager delayed a decision that impacted 3 teams. No explanation, just silence. People worked around it, covered for it. No one escalated. I noticed. I asked about it. The response was familiar. He's under a lot of pressure. He's juggling priorities. We don't want to overwhelm him. The work absorbed the cost. I let it go. Then it happened again. Another leader missed a commitment. Another delay. Another excuse. The pattern was forming. Not malicious. Complacent. People had learned that as long as outcomes eventually materialized, the cost of delay could be redistributed quietly. That's how old habits creep back. Not with ego, with exhaustion, I realized I was at risk of becoming complicit, not because I agreed, but because I was tired. So I changed how I responded. The next time it happened, I didn't escalate emotionally. I escalated structurally. I asked for a postmortem, not to assign blame, to examine impact. We laid out what the delay had caused. Overtime, rework, missed opportunities, team frustration, no theatrics, just facts. The leader in question was uncomfortable. Good. Discomfort is a signal. The room adjusted. People started flagging risks earlier, escalating sooner, owning delays instead of hiding them. But every shift creates friction. A group of senior leaders asked for a closed-door conversation. They were polite, careful. They told me I was raising the bar. They said some felt exposed. I listened. Then I asked a question. Are we uncomfortable because the expectations are unreasonable? I said, or because they're visible? No one answered immediately. That was the answer. I left the meeting knowing I'd crossed another threshold. I was no longer just a leader. I was a standard. And standards are threatening to people who've survived on flexibility. The client from the original project reached out again around this time. Not with a problem, with an invitation. They wanted me involved in an advisory capacity on an industry panel. Public-facing. Thought leadership. I accepted. Visibility outside the company changes dynamics inside it. People paid more attention to my words, quoted me, referenced my frameworks. Some resented it. Others leaned in. Nathan reached out for the first time in over a year. A LinkedIn message. Short, neutral. Hope you're doing well. I've been following your work. Impressive growth. I didn't respond. Not out of spite. Out of closure. Victor sent a congratulatory email after the panel announcement. Professional. Polite. Slightly stiff. I replied with thanks. We'd settled into something like détente. No more games. No more illusions. Just boundaries. Then HR brought me something I hadn't expected. They wanted me to help design a new leadership training program, specifically focused on ethical leadership and accountability. They asked me why I thought it was needed. I told them the truth. Because talent leaves when credit is stolen, I said, and trust collapses when decisions are hidden. They listened. The program launched quietly, not mandatory, but influential. People who attended learned how to document responsibly, how to give credit publicly, how to escalate without drama. Some people mocked it. Those people stopped getting promoted. Not officially, but functionally. The company was learning. Slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. I thought about leaving. Several times. I had offers. Better pay. Less friction. Fresh starts. But something kept me where I was. Not loyalty. Responsibility. I'd seen what happened when people like me walked away. The vacuum got filled by people like Nathan. Or Victor. Or worse. So I stayed. And I watched. And I intervened when it mattered. One day, a junior employee came to me shaking. Her manager had taken credit for a deliverable she'd led. Presented it as his own. She had proof. Emails. Drafts. Messages. She asked me what to do. I didn't hesitate. I coached her through escalation. Helped her frame facts. Sat in the meeting. The truth came out. Her manager apologized publicly. She got recognition. The team noticed. Word spread. People started coming to me earlier. Before resentment turned into resignation. That was the moment I understood something deeply. This wasn't just my story anymore. It was a pattern being interrupted. And that interruption mattered. I didn't feel powerful. I felt accountable. Because once you know how damage happens, you don't get to pretend you don't see it. You don't get to stay silent for comfort. That's how cycles repeat. The irony is that the revenge I once imagined, vindication, exposure, downfall, felt small compared to this. Compared to changing how people behaved when no one was watching. Compared to creating space where work spoke louder than politics. I didn't become perfect. I made mistakes. I still do. But I never forgot what it felt like to be erased quietly. And I never let that become acceptable. The story kept unfolding. Not in headlines. In habits. In decisions. In moments where someone could have taken credit and chose not to. Where someone could have delayed and chose to decide. That's how real change happens. Not with explosions, but with refusal. And I was still refusing. Every day. By the time I realized the company had changed, it wasn't because of a memo or a restructuring announcement. It was because the quiet stories stopped repeating themselves. The whispered complaints about stolen credit slowed down. The late-night messages asking, "Is this normal?" became rarer. Escalations happened earlier, cleaner, with less fear attached to them. Not gone, just different. And that's when something unexpected happened. I became tired in a new way. Not burned out. Not resentful. Just aware. Aware that holding the line takes constant effort. That systems don't stay honest on their own. That every gain has to be defended, not with aggression, but with attention. The more stable things became, the more I understood why people eventually stopped pushing. It's not because they stopped caring. It's because caring requires vigilance. And vigilance isn't glamorous. Around this time, leadership asked me to take on another responsibility. A cross-company review group. Temporary, they said. Strategic oversight during a transition. I said yes. And almost immediately I saw it. A familiar pattern, dressed in better language. One of the division heads, let's call him Aaron, had a reputation for being brilliant but complex. That's how leadership framed it. Visionary, big thinker, hard to pin down. The teams under him were constantly busy, but nothing ever seemed finished. Projects circled endlessly, decisions revisited, accountability diffused. I asked for status updates. I got philosophies. I asked for timelines. I got dependencies. I asked for owners. I got committees. It was Nathan's insecurity combined with Victor's narrative control. Refined, more sophisticated, harder to confront. When I raised concerns, leadership hesitated. He's influential, they said. We need him. I recognized that phrase too. It's what people say when they're afraid of disruption. So I changed tactics again. I didn't challenge Aaron directly. I challenged the outcomes. I asked teams to present their work without intermediaries. I requested concrete deliverables. I set deadlines that forced decisions instead of discussions. Aaron didn't like it. He pushed back politely, questioned scope, questioned authority. I stayed calm. Leadership watched closely. Then a client escalated. Different client, different project, same complaint, lack of clarity, shifting direction, no accountability. This time, leadership didn't ask me if it was serious. They asked me what to do. I told them the truth. This won't resolve with coaching, I said. It resolves with ownership. Aaron was given a choice. Clarify authority. Commit to decisions. Accept accountability. Or step aside. He tried. For about a month. Then old habits returned. Leadership reassigned his portfolio. Publicly framed as strategic realignment. Privately understood as a correction. I watched it happen with a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief, because the system was working. Sadness, because I knew how disorienting it feels to lose control you thought you deserved. Aaron didn't confront me. He didn't thank me either. He just disappeared from my calendar. That was becoming a pattern too. People didn't fight on the way out. They faded, and that told me everything. I started thinking about my own exit, not in fear, in planning, because no one should be the person holding the line forever. If the system truly learns, it shouldn't need you indefinitely. That's how you know you've succeeded. I began mentoring someone quietly, not officially designated, just someone I saw potential in. She asked good questions, not performative ones, real ones. She noticed patterns early, documented naturally, didn't chase visibility. I saw myself in her, and I realized something important. The goal was never to win. It was to replace yourself, to make sure that when you eventually step away, the behavior doesn't snap back. That accountability isn't tied to one person's presence. I started stepping back intentionally, letting others lead meetings, letting them take credit, letting them make decisions. And I watched. Some rose, some stumbled, but the system held. Leadership intervened appropriately. Clients stayed satisfied. Work stayed visible. That was new. One evening, I found myself alone again in that same conference room with the city lights outside. But this time, I wasn't replaying the past. I was measuring distance. From the woman who'd been quietly removed from her own project. From the version of myself who'd thought revenge meant exposure. From the belief that justice had to be loud to be real. What I'd learned instead was this. The most dangerous people in workplaces aren't the loud ones. They're the ones who teach systems how to tolerate distortion. And the most effective resistance isn't confrontation. It's clarity that refuses to bend. I didn't know yet how the story would end. Whether I'd stay another year or leave tomorrow. Whether I'd build something new or protect what already existed. But I knew this much. No one was taking my work quietly again. And no one around me was going to disappear without a trace if I could help it. The next chapter was coming. Not as a crisis, as a choice. And that finally felt like power. The last turning point didn't come with an argument. It came with an offer. It was a quiet call from a company I'd partnered with years earlier. Different industry, different scale. They wanted me to help build something from the ground up. Not fix, not clean up, build. I didn't say yes immediately. I didn't say no either. I sat with it. Because walking away from a system you helped change feels different than leaving one that failed you. At my current company, things were stable. Not perfect, but honest enough. Credit moved more cleanly. Decisions had owners. People spoke up sooner. The culture wasn't fearless, but it wasn't silent anymore. That mattered. And yet, I knew something else too. I had become a reference point. People checked themselves because I was there. That's not sustainable forever. Systems don't truly mature until they can operate without a specific person holding the line. So I tested it. I stepped back further. Not disengaged, but quieter. I stopped being the first voice in meetings. Let others speak. Let them correct. Let them escalate. And I watched. When credit drifted, someone pulled it back. When decisions stalled, someone pushed. When someone tried to reframe work that wasn't theirs, another voice corrected it. Casually, confidently. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. That's when I knew. The work had outgrown me. I accepted the offer. I told leadership myself. No rumors. No leaks. Just facts. They were surprised. Then thoughtful. Then honest. You've changed how this place works, one executive said. We're better because of it. I thanked them. On my last week, people stopped by my desk. Some thanked me. Some shared stories I'd never heard before. Moments where something I'd done, or refused to do, had mattered quietly. One woman said, I stayed because I saw what happened to you. I thought maybe it could be different. That stayed with me. Nathan never reached out again. Victor sent a short, gracious note wishing me well. I wished him the same. There was no final confrontation. No victory lap. Just a clean ending. On my last day, I packed my things slowly. The office looked the same. The people felt different. As I walked out, I thought about the title of this story. My boss took me off a major project. The client demanded my return. That's how it started. But that wasn't the real story. The real story was what happened after. What happens when someone tries to erase your work quietly and you don't panic? What happens when you choose documentation over drama, clarity over confrontation, consistency over revenge? What happens when you realize that the most powerful response isn't exposing someone? it's becoming undeniable. I didn't win because I was louder. I won because I was steady. Because I let the truth accumulate until it couldn't be ignored. Because I didn't disappear when it would have been easier to leave. And because I learned something I'll carry into every room I ever enter again. If someone takes credit for your work, they're telling you who they are. If a system allows it, it's telling you what it values. And if you decide to stay, you're choosing whether to become invisible or to change the rules. So now I'm curious. If you were in my position, what would you have done? Would you have stayed quiet and moved on? Would you have fought back immediately? Or would you have done what I did and waited for the moment when speaking wasn't risky anymore? If this story captivated you, make sure to subscribe for more behind-the-scenes workplace drama, real-life betrayal, and human stories that unfold just like this. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss a story. And here's the harder question. If you've ever benefited from someone else's silence, would you recognize it? Or would you convince yourself you earned it? That's what I want to know.